Republicans who had a choice of making the guy who covered up the rape of college wrestlers your new Speaker of the House, or of making the guy who gave a speech to David Duke's white supremacist organization your new Speaker of the House, but not both. How could you make up your mind? I mean, they're both perfect in their own ways, right? The only relevance of the choice Republicans completely failed to make yesterday, Representative Beelzebub or Representative Lucifer, is that Trump endorsed Jim Jordan, and even in conference, House Republicans rejected Trump's endorsee 113 to 99, with two caveats. The first caveat being it was a secret ballot, so those who betrayed the will of their Lord and Savior and voted for Scalise will be unknown to him until their colleagues rat them out. And one wonders if it had been a voice vote in public and on the record, if anybody would have voted for Scalise. The second caveat is, unless the Republicans have changed the numbers, 113 plus 99 is 212. And at least 217 have to vote for the nominee for Speaker. And Ken Buck said he didn't vote for either of them and won't vote for either of them on the floor. And Boebert and Max Miller and Barney Rubble and Bob Good and a couple of others say they'll vote for Jim Jordan, or at least not for Scalise. And the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, and yes, that name is chosen ironically, says he's not sure. And George Santos put out a press release literally saying he will vote for whoever will not expel him from Congress. And Congresswoman Spartz of Indiana says, quote, "I cannot tell you what I'm going to do on the floor right now." And nobody has ever better summed up the Republican agenda more concisely. Oh, and Nancy Mace says she's voting Jordan anyway, and that, quote, "I've actually talked to Democrats who trust him." And clearly that A that she wore on her shirt Tuesday, that was for Ambien. And now what does Jordan do? Here he was, all ready to shut down the government until the Democrats agreed to not let in any more immigrants ever again. And instead, he's got Troy Nehls out there saying now is the time to bring in Trump as Speaker. Things are desperate enough for Jordan that Time magazine says his allies were last night trying to portray Steve Scalise as just another Washington insider, a swamp creature whose congressional campaign has, wait for it, spent more than $500,000 at a D.C. restaurant called the Capitol Grille since 2011. And I hate to have to defend Steve Scalise, but since 2011, that's $113 a night. And $113 a night at Capitol Grille is literally the price of 2 filet mignons and a side of creamed spinach for the table and no tip. And anyway, you're burying the headline right here, Jim Jordan allies. Evidence of a Republican actually paying for something himself? By the way, if Jim Jordan were not having enough of a bad week, Fani Willis wrote him yesterday, basically accusing him of obstruction of justice, something I suggested the last time she wrote to Jordan, which was on September 7th. Only this time, she cited the actual interference statute by number in the Georgia State Penal Code, and she did it in her 4th sentence, and hot damn, I think she might actually try to indict him now. She does give him another option, however, quote, that you are ignorant of the United States and Georgia constitutions and codes, and again tells him that his demands for information about federal funding for her office and details of any contact with the Attorney General's Office of Special Counsel and specifics of her indictment of Trump, he already has or has no right to have. She ends by reminding him that 6 weeks ago, the last time she used the U.S. Postal Service to slap his pee-pee, she provided him, quote, with 4 noble suggested uses of your authority as chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. 1, enhancing funding for victim witness advocates. 2, expanding funding for testing all rape kits. 3, supporting the Credible Messengers program, which helps to turn around children in trouble within the criminal justice system. And 4, ensuring adequate funding to support state crime labs, which test for drugs like fentanyl. And I don't know who number 4 is supposed to be meant for. Jordan? Trump? Maybe Mace? Or maybe Derek Van Orden of Wisconsin, seen at the January 6th coup attempt and seen telling Robert Reich, spelled R-E-I-C-H, that he should change his first name to Third, and last seen swearing at and threatening a bunch of teenage Senate pages. Van Orden has now reportedly sworn at a bunch of briefers from the White House who were updating a group of congressmen about Israel. When Democratic Representative Phillips of Minnesota, who is Jewish, replied, "Shame on you," Van Orden dropped an F-bomb on him, too. So maybe the fentanyl thing isn't sufficient for this guy. Sounds more like he needs chloroform. And, of course, all of this drug talk takes us back to Trump, who has interrupted his week-long tirade against the real enemy in the world right now, Forbes magazine, which dropped him from the Forbes 400 in some sort of conspiracy between a magazine and New York's Attorney General, to inform us that Israel was attacked because the 2020 election was rigged, which is nuts, even for Trump.
And if the election wasn't rigged, there would be nobody even thinking about going into Israel. Instead of keeping terrorists and terrorist sympathizers out of America, the Biden administration is inviting them in. You know why? Because he's got a boss. Who's his boss? Barack Hussein Obama. Barack Hussein. Barack Hussein Obama. Remember the great Rush Limbaugh? Barack Hussein Obama. Here you go, Barack Hussein Obama. Hello, Lee. Unbelievably, the corrupt Biden Department of Justice recently invited an Iranian-backed judge from Iraq to visit our nation's capital. Isn't that nice? He couldn't have been too impressed with our capital. It looks like shit. I'll never forget that Bibi Netanyahu let us down. That was a very terrible thing, I will say that. So we were disappointed by that, very disappointed, but we did the job ourselves, and it was absolute precision, magnificent, beautiful job. And then Bibi tried to take credit for it. That wasn't good. That didn't make me feel too good, but that's all right. So they got to strengthen themselves up.
Trump has also submitted his delay of the week motion. He demands from Judge Chutkan in the insurrection case in Washington subpoenas to the Archivist of the United States, the House of Representatives, Homeland Security, the successors to the January 6th committee, the special counsel to the president, and Congressman Benny Thompson and Barry Loudermilk. This is more than just Trump's usual stall. This is clearly his lawyer's latest attempt to humor him and validate this story he heard somewhere, or maybe he read it on a fortune cookie, that there are, quote, missing records from the January 6th committee, even though there aren't missing records. There is a wonderful irony in there that Trump and his ambulance chasers, of course, do not acknowledge that some of the supposed records, they say, would serve as evidence of where Trump and other White House staffers were and what they were saying on January 6th, facts which, even though Trump and his attorneys and his apologists seem to have forgotten this, is kind of the point of the trial. A couple of other side notes from the slowly turning wheels of justice. Jack Smith has also filed a seemingly inscrutable motion, one that indicates that about 25 witnesses in the Washington case, including one unidentified member of Trump's family, have withheld information from the special counsel's office based on attorney-client privilege. And so what? Well, Smith wants Chutkan to order Trump to disclose by December 18th whether or not he intends to raise the advice of counsel defense about which his public apologists spoke constantly for about a month there. You know, how can you indict him for simply doing what his lawyers told him? And how can it be illegal to simply get bad advice from your attorneys? In his filing, Smith notes that if Trump's defense really is, the devil lawyers made me do it, then nobody in the case can say, I can't talk about that because of attorney-client privilege. Bottom line here is Trump has lived his life by outlasting and outstalling his opponents in a million different courtrooms. It continues to be ever more abundantly clear, however, that in Jack Smith, he has met the Babe Ruth of courtroom process. There is another ruling now from a court in the Southern District of New York that supposedly extends Jessica Denson's escape from the non-disclosure agreement she was forced to sign when she worked for the Trump campaign in 2016 to all campaign employees. And you don't have to be a political expert or a legal one to understand what would happen if the NDAs don't apply anymore. But I do find it hard to believe that Trump will let this go with at least no fewer than 73 more appeals. And to that end, Law and Crime News reports that the bid to disqualify Trump from the ballot via the 14th Amendment, the one that continues to unfold in Colorado, now includes perhaps the most finely split hair in constitutional history. Trump's attorneys are trying to get that case dismissed because while they concede there is a disqualification clause in the 14th Amendment and it is not limited to use after the Civil War, it still doesn't apply to Trump because it doesn't apply to presidents. They insist that the clause specifies only government officers who are required to, quote, support, unquote, the Constitution, while the oath of the president reads, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And again, the constitutional hair split may or may not have any validity, but the problem here is Trump sure does have us on the facts. Because if there is one thing that is inescapably true about Donald Trump, it is that he has never, not once, supported the Constitution. Internationally, while the war continues to escalate, the hunt for some direct evidence that Iran was specifically involved in the attack on Israel continues to narrow. It is now 5 days later, and nobody's found a gun, let alone a smoking one. This is not to whitewash Iran. It has supported and supplied Hamas in the past. Its hands are not clean. But as the State Department spokesman John Kirby told CNN, quote, we have seen no evidence in the intelligence that they were witting on it, pre-aware, or were involved in any of the planning, resourcing, or even directing of the operation, unquote. Just as assuredly, while the exact time frame is still moving around, it seems that the reports that Egyptian intelligence warned some authority in Israel, its intel counterparts, or the Netanyahu government, or Netanyahu himself, or all of them, this is now written in stone. Even the Republican chair of the House Foreign Relations Committee, Michael McCaul, admits it. Quote, we know that Egypt had warned the Israelis 3 days prior that an event like this could happen. We know that this has been planned as long as a year ago. Asked if he was relaying intelligence that he'd seen or heard, or just something he'd heard on, say, this podcast, McCaul answered, quote, I don't want to get too much in the classified, but a warning was given. And the bottom line here is Iran may still later prove to be implicated directly, but it looks less and less likely. The unindicted co-conspirator here is Russia, where Hamas leadership traveled twice in the last year to meet with the foreign minister Lavrov. As I emphasized yesterday, if any American politician tries to rationalize pulling our support out from under Ukraine so the money can instead be sent to Israel, he or she is, in fact, acting as a Russian asset. Because to hurt Ukraine is to help Russia, and to help Russia is to help Hamas, and to help Hamas is to hurt Israel. And not to bounce around too much, but I close with something I first heard weeks ago and was so convinced it was a clerical error that I actually tweeted it must have been misheard information, and it ain't. Semaphore News reports the commentator Cenk Uygur is running for president of... Seriously. He says he's challenging Biden for the Democratic nomination. Quote, I'm going to do whatever I can to help him decide that this is not the right path. If he retires now, he's a hero. He beat Trump. He did a good job of being a steward of the economy. If he doesn't, he loses to Trump, and he's the villain of the story, unquote. If Cenk Uygur upholds his own track record, this means Biden will win next year in a landslide over some other Republican nominee. I have never in my life seen any liberal commentator or analyst more wrong, more often, by more of a margin than Cenk Uygur. At MSNBC years ago, I had the additional sinking feeling that he had a hard time separating what was true from what he wanted to be true. I forbade my staff from booking him as a guest. After I left MSNBC, they hired him to do, I think, the 6 p.m. show, then fired him, and the people I still knew there said they had had the same worries, plus he was the opposite of a ratings draw. Uygur then contacted my employers at Current TV and would not leave them alone until I put him on Countdown there to discuss his MSNBC exit. My bosses wanted to know if they should sign him as a host or a contributor, and I said, no, not yet. Use the ratings for his guest shot on my show as your guide. And our ratings not only did not go up that night, they dropped. And naturally, Joel Hyatt, Al Gore's partner, co-owner of the network, and the operational chief, who was one of the real-life models for the Jason Robards character in the film Philadelphia, the guy who fired his law office chief there because he contracted AIDS, promptly hired Cenk Uygur. That hiring was the first of the 30, 40 final straws that led me to leave Current and sue their asses. More importantly and relevantly, Joe Biden has no earthly clue who Cenk Uygur is. So this idea that Uygur is going to help him decide not to run is nonsense bordering on delusions of grandeur, as is the most important issue. Cenk Uygur was born in Turkey. He emigrated here at the age of 8. The Constitution is rather exact on this point. He's not eligible to be president. Yet he tells Semaphore News that more than 2 centuries of constitutional precedents are wrong, that you don't have to be born here, or at least born outside the country, but the child of U.S. citizens who happen to be outside the country, to become president. He predicts he would receive a, quote, slam dunk victory on this in the Supreme Court. Sure, Alexander Hamilton did not challenge it, even though he was born in the West Indies barely 20 years before the country was born. But you'll get a slam dunk victory from the Clarence Thomas Supreme Court. Let me sum this up. Cenk Uygur is an idiot. Please stay the F home. The grown-ups are trying to resolve this. Also of interest here, nothing. Just Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA equating Zionism and communism during the middle of the Israel-Hamas shooting war. That's next. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann, my crazy friend.
Still ahead on Countdown, like that guy should talk. I just noticed this. October 1st was the 30th anniversary of the day we launched ESPN2. And they didn't do anything to commemorate it. And I didn't do anything to commemorate it. I forgot. God knows when we started it in 1993, we treated it as if we had invented alchemy. What happens when executives decide that their new product is going to be hip? And that's an order coming up in Things I Promise Not to Tell. Or for today, we'll call it Things I Promise Not to Tell 2. First time for the daily roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who constitute today's worst persons in the world. The bronze, and there is a sports theme, Senator Tommy Tuberville of Alabama. If he's not the dumbest man in America, he's close to it, and he was reminded of that fact yesterday. If only he understood. July 12th it was when Tommy the Tuba, who supports Russia in its invasion of Ukraine and whose block of American military promotion has hampered this country's response to the taking of the American hostages in Gaza, said of the president, quote, "You watch Joe Biden over in Europe, I'm afraid he's gonna fall down every time I turn on television." Apart from the inanity of the remark, so you're saying you think he'll fall down because you turned on the television? Coach Tommy forgets that the internet never forgets. Never, never, never. Yesterday, from 2014, the internet regurgitated video of Tuberville, then a failed college football coach as opposed to a failed senator, coming down a flight of stairs from an airplane after a football bowl game. He hits one wrong stair and literally falls down and slides down more than 12 steps. Punchline? Tuberville's slip and slide took place as his University of Cincinnati team lost that bowl game, and it was the Military Bowl. You know, you would have thought, by the way, those giant Dumbo ears of his would have provided Tuberville some balance, or maybe even some ballast. The runner-up, National Hockey League Commissioner Gary Bettman, told you the other day this was not going away. Bettman caved to homophobes and Russians and first refused to defend Pride Nights at NHL games when they attacked them, and has now in essence banned Pride Nights, and with them virtually every other cause night that the league has so prominently celebrated recently. No player-related events, no warm-up uniforms with Pride colors, not even any Pride-colored sports tape for players who want to put on their hockey sticks. Well, Gary's going to have a problem with that one. Scott Lawton of the Philadelphia Flyers now reacts to the Pride ban by saying, "Try me." Quote, "You'll probably see me with the Pride tape on that night anyway," unquote. And Brian Burke, who has run 6 different NHL franchises and is now the head of the Professional Women's Hockey League Players Association, basically told members of the LGBTQ community and every other group that has been betrayed by Gary Bettman to ignore Gary Bettman. Quote, "This is a surprising and serious setback," Berkey writes. "If you are a member of one of the communities who has been celebrated as part of the Hockey is for Everyone initiative, please know that you are still a valued member of the hockey community. We will not lose the incredible progress we've made in inclusion over the last decade, and we are counting on the league for continued support and leadership in this area," unquote. I suspect that what Brian Burke is implying here is that this is a serious enough blunder that it could escalate to the point of costing Commissioner Bettman his job. God knows enough people in hockey have wanted to get rid of him for years anyway, and he's just added to that because that catchphrase that Burke mentioned, "hockey is for everyone," well, Gary Bettman has personally, in essence, changed it to "hockey is for homophobes." But the winners, speaking of which, right-wing troll and balloon head Charlie Kirk and his fascist organization, Turning Point USA, TPUSA, or as it is alternatively known, Toilet Paper USA. One of its so-called ambassadors, Morgan Ariel, or maybe it's Ariel Morgan, or Mariel Organ. It's hard to say. Whoever she has decided to position Charlie Kirk and Turning Point kind of oddly as the Middle East goes up in flames. Ms. Ariel tweeting, quote, "Zionism and communism go hand in hand," unquote. So if you'd like to make a list of the TPUSA staffers and donors and advisors who Ms. Ariel just identified as belonging to an anti-Semitic organization while Israel is at war, there's Benny Johnson, Jack Posobiec, and of course, Ginny Thomas. Morgan, Ariel, Morgan, Organ, whatever her name is, Turning Point USA, and Charlie Kirk, today's worst anti-Semitic persons in the world! ESPN2. They talked me into becoming the face of this first of ESPN's endless clones of its television self. I wore a brown leather bomber jacket, and I said the first words in the first actual program, and those words were, "Good evening and welcome to the end of our careers." And that's pretty much all anybody remembers of this unmitigated disaster. ESPN2 exists today, of course, and successfully, but it only became successful when they stopped trying to make it something different from original ESPN, and management, with genuine heartbreak, accepted the idea that all the nation wanted was more ESPN, not different kinds of ESPN. That begat ESPN News, ESPNU, ESPN Plus, ESPN The Ocho, Tartar Control ESPN. But that's not what they wanted ESPN2 to be. They wanted it to be hip and cool, for kids. And they were going to make it hip and cool and force it to be hip and cool if it killed them. And you. And for that matter, me. It is why they took the co-anchor of their most successful sports center ever and broke up the partnership and moved him to a new network that almost literally had more people who thought they were in charge of it than watched it. And why, 3 months later, when Sports Illustrated magazine chose ESPN2 as the 7th worst thing to happen in sports in the year 1993, only the 7th worst, we were grateful. And I then scurried back to SportsCenter, and we all pretended like ESPN2 had never happened, and we almost never mentioned it again. But the saga of why it went so desperately and immediately wrong is worth telling in brief. And if you will listen to it, I will tell you something I have never admitted publicly before. Why, when they asked me to leave SportsCenter after a very first successful year on SportsCenter to go do this cockamamie new network thing, why on earth, given the choice, I actually said yes. Nobody knows this. You will in a few minutes. But first, by the time I went to work there in 1992, ESPN had finally moved out of its perennial status of near bankruptcy and near irrelevancy to profit and prominence. From the launch in 1979 through the mid-1980s, the place had always either had a new owner or a new schedule or a new plan to avert bankruptcy. When I joined the fledgling sports department at CNN in 1981, I used to watch my high school classmate Chris Berman do his show called SportsCenter from what was obviously a closet with one light, no air conditioning, and no teleprompter. Sometimes it would be 20 minutes long. Sometimes it would be 2 minutes long. Each time I'd look at poor Chris, schwitzing and looking a little claustrophobic, and I'd say, well, hooray for CNN Sports, we're not the worst. But by 1992, ESPN had begun to be willing to spend a little money to bring in a prominent local sportscaster from Los Angeles, me, and give him the keys to the 11 o'clock Sports Center. And this company, which did not have any merchandise, did not sell anything with its logo on it, finally decided to expand and launch an all-sports radio network. And when those plans did not go very well, they spent a little extra money, and they talked me into moving to Connecticut 3 months earlier than planned to launch the radio network, and it was an instantaneous hit. By early 1993, then, there were rumblings and then rumors and finally an announcement that they would build upon the radio success by starting a second television network, ESPN and ESPN2. But, and from the beginning, this was the point. It was not going to be just another ESPN or the ESPN spillover channel or the channel for when there's a great basketball game and a great football game at the same time and we want to cover both. It was going to be different. There'd be live broadcasts of games just like ESPN. There'd be a studio sports show just like SportsCenter, but it'd be hip, for kids. In the SportsCenter newsroom, the assumption was the face of ESPN2 was going to be Mike Tirico. Mike had had a very tough 1992, and it seemed like something that could reestablish him in the company, or if he had a tough 1993, something he could be jettisoned from if the whole thing went up in flames. I heard Robin Roberts' name mentioned once or twice, and I don't know if they ever approached Robin, and I think Tirico told me once they had mentioned it to him, but never seriously. So when they called me into my boss's office in the spring of 1993, I just assumed they were yelling at me for something I said, since that's what they usually called me in for, or called me and Dan Patrick in for, or called Dan in just to yell at him for something I had said. Instead, they offered me ESPN2. We want you to be to ESPN2, said John Walsh, who basically ran everything ESPN did that was not a ball game. We want you to be for ESPN2 what Chris Berman is to ESPN. They explained that there would be younger sports on there, X Games stuff, and mountain biking. They kept talking about mountain biking and a lot of stuff with trees. But that the flagship program would match my sense of humor exactly, that it would just be snarky and flip and with it and hip and cool, for kids. They said they would let me continue on SportsCenter until August and then have me work for 2 months, helping them design and rehearse the new show. They actually wanted my opinion, and they offered to give me like a 25% raise. Understand, though, ESPN of 1993 would fight you over an $11 cab ride on an expense report. They would call you into a meeting. They would spend 30 minutes on this. They would then offer you $8. A 25% raise was the 1993 ESPN equivalent of eternal life. Still, I had my doubts. For one thing, as it was, we seemed to be pretty hip and cool on SportsCenter, as it was. Dan Patrick and I had an on-air relationship that you could not practice, nor design, nor cast. It was just there or it wasn't. We were the two guys in the World War I bunker who knew that the Jerrys would eventually get us right in the Somme. So all we could do was first take out as many of them as we could and sing and laugh while we did it. But I had two reasons for saying yes anyway, and I'll save the one I've never told anybody at all for the end of this recollection. The other reason was, believe it or not, I'm a team player. I am not the guy who will come in and lie on behalf of the team, and I am not the guy who will turn away and say nothing when the coach is slapping the crap out of one of my teammates. But if you say, we are management, we have thought this through, we want you to leave SportsCenter to go do ESPN2 and be hip and cool, for kids, I will say yes. Plus money. Only they had not thought it through, as it proved. The first problem was the new network that was supposed to be different from ESPN and the new show that was supposed to be different from ESPN SportsCenter was going to be run by John Walsh, the guy who ran SportsCenter and basically created what you saw then and what you see now. And to actually produce the show, he chose Mike Bogad, who was the coordinating producer of the 11 o'clock SportsCenter that I was doing with Dan Patrick, and Norby Williamson, who was the line producer of the 11 o'clock SportsCenter with me and Dan Patrick. And although they would not give me a title other than anchor, the other guy running it was me, the co-host of the 11 o'clock SportsCenter. To add to this crowd of rebellious, innovative, anti-establishment thinkers who yesterday had been the establishment, John Walsh hired the sports editor of the Boston Globe, Vince Doria. To my mind, Vince would cover himself in glory at ESPN2 by once proposing a really bad idea, a laugh track for the Nick Bakay comedy segments. And when I said, that's a really bad idea, it's still a newscast, what if we have a laugh track someday when some team's plane crashes? He said, you're right. I'm thinking maybe I don't know as much about this TV stuff as I thought I did. Will you tell me the next time I have an idea that's that bad? But at this point, Vince was thinking maybe we could differentiate ESPN2 from ESPN by showing baseball and basketball box scores overnight. There was an opinion, and Vince held it, that we should be the Christian Science monitor of sportscasts on ESPN2, which was definitely not, for kids. The show producers they brought in were also mainstream. My friend and producer Ron Grelnick came in from Los Angeles. He actually thought they meant the stuff about younger sports. He bought a magazine rack and subscribed us to all kinds of biking magazines and hiking magazines, and nobody ever read them. They hired producers from Madison Square Garden Network. They hired associate producers from SportsCenter and made them producers. To join me on the anchor desk, they hired a newspaper columnist from Detroit named Mitch Albom. And they hired all the local sportscasters they did not have room for on SportsCenter, and among them was a guy named Stu Scott. And Stu was great, but Stu and everybody else just came in and did regular sportscasts, just as if they'd been on regular flavor ESPN. Finally, to be my real co-host, they were going to hire Well, we never found out who they were going to hire because one day the word came through that the chairman of ABC Cap Cities, which owned ESPN and everything else, had seen this weekend sportscaster in West Palm Beach doing a tennis tournament of some sort or rain delay during a tennis tournament or something and thought she was great. And overnight, there was a bidding war for her and we had just hired her to be my co-host and her name was Susie Colbert. Everybody on this renegade network, including me, was thoroughly non-renegade. It became rather apparent rather quickly that management's understanding of what made something cool and hip, for kids, was, you ready? What clothing we wore. This is the story of the infamous leather jacket I wore the first night, which you will hear when Countdown continues after this. Back to the number one story on the Countdown and things I promised not to tell on Saturday's 29th anniversary of the launch of ESPN2, or as I described it to Kenny Mayne for his podcast yesterday, the Titanic, only it's on fire first. As I said, the organizing principle was forced hipness, and the organizing principle of forced hipness was the clothing we wore. And that brings us to the primary image that still appears whenever the launch of ESPN2 is broached or Googled, my infamous brown leather bomber jacket. Fall comes early to Bristol, Connecticut, and if it were not cold enough there at the end of September 1993, there was also something wrong with our new ESPN2 studio. No matter what they did to the air conditioning system in there, it was like 48 degrees all the time. So I was standing outside one day trying to get warm, contemplating the succession of train wrecks that had been our first 5 or 6 pilot shows and dry runs, and I was wearing my brown leather bomber jacket because it was cold, when another of the many executive producers, John Lack, came over to say hi. And he was in mid-sentence when he looked at the jacket and went stone cold silent. Wait, he finally said, the word eureka forming over his head. Could you, if I asked you, would you wear that jacket on the show? I pretended to hesitate. I realized only the jacket could save me from freezing to death in our winter on the TV version of the Donner Party, and so I said, I suppose. And that's why I was wearing that jacket. It was cold in the studio. Why they gave Steve Buckley from the Boston Herald a baseball cap to wear on the air for his segments and wear backwards. Why they put other guys in football helmets and insisted that nobody wear a tie ever, not even former Boston College football coach Jack Bicknell. That should be obvious, for kids. It became rapidly apparent that all ESPN2 was ESPN dressed up differently. I had a leather coat. The on-screen graphics were in lowercase letters only. The camera was not on a tripod. It was carried around by a cameraman who soon had a bad back. The other problem was exemplified by that fellow John Lack. I liked him. He had run MTV News, and he actually had some ideas about differentiating presentation and content for younger audiences. But by the time he suggested the jacket, he also had a second message for me. Listen, he said, I can't get through to these people. They tell me I'm in charge, and then they tell me our first new hip revolutionary story is going to be a profile of Doug Flutie, the quarterback, and I say, how's that different from SportsCenter? And they look at me like I'm crazy, and they say, he's playing in Canada. We'll be doing a story about Canada. Who would believe we're going to do a story about Canada? But I know you get it, Keith. So when we're actually on the air, you have to keep it different. You have to be in charge. When we're on, you are the executive producer. This was extremely bad news because by my count, this would have made me the 15th or 16th different person who believed they were in charge. There was John Lack, there was Walsh, there was a new vice president named Howard Katz, there was Vince Doria, there were the two SportsCenter guys, Norby and Bogey, there were the line producers, there were a couple of consultants, there was the president of ESPN, Steve Bornstein, there was the chairman of ABC who had discovered Susie Colbert, there was the guy who put in the state-of-the-art air conditioning system in the studio, there was the other guy, Walter Cronkite's lighting director, as he kept telling us, who put in the state-of-the-art lighting system, all of us, individually, in charge. So nobody was in charge. The night before the premiere, so September 30th, 1993, John Walsh, the SportsCenter man, saw me in the hallway and said, listen, I just got some amazing information from audience research. Do you know which show in all of television has the highest percentage of viewers who are aged 18 to 24? This was an important question, a relevant question, because these were the kids, for kids. ESPN2 had been created to get that 18 to 24-year-old audience. So I guess the answer was, I don't know, some show on MTV. No, Walsh said gleefully. It's SportsCenter. And I froze. And I said, wait, John, if we already have the 18 to 24-year-old audience, why are we starting a new network to get the 18 to 24-year-old audience? Do you really think they're going to give up the show they like and move to a new show on a new channel just cause? And Walsh laughed and shrugged and shuffled down the hallway, and I called a cab to take me to the Hartford airport so I could leave the country. Only at the last minute I chickened out. The premiere, October 1st, began with me, I swear this is true, going to shave in my house and instead dropping and breaking a mirror. The network signed on at 7 p.m. with the national anthem and some sort of statement from Chris Berman blessing it. And then a very long sketch parody of the then hit film The Fugitive, in which I was the fugitive from SportsCenter. Get it? The fugitive from SportsCenter, you get it? Then the lights came on, the poor guy with the camera staggered in, and I said, good evening and welcome to the end of our careers. The television sports writer of the Associated Press, John Nelson, was there in the studio. He immediately flashed that quote to a not waiting world, and ESPN2 and Sports Night were born. For kids. The first night seemed okay, largely because ESPN threw a party in the parking lot under a gigantic tent, free food and booze. Hundreds of staffers and guests and celebrities and free booze. That place later became known as the Tent of Consent. Don't ask me. I was on the air in 3 hours. I had nothing to do with this. Later that night, near the tent, the network president stumbled crossing a little bridge over a stream and wound up in the water. And he still had a better night than we did. The shows bounced from topic to topic and mood to mood. Once, with Bill Pito anchoring with me, Sports Night ran a mini documentary on a high school basketball star who chose which college to go to play ball at entirely by letter and telephone. Only when he arrived did he discover he was the only white guy in an entirely black conference. We showed the first 10 minutes of this extraordinary story. Then we promised to show you the rest of it. And then we welcomed a live studio guest, Eddie Layton, the organist from Yankee Stadium. He played a few tunes, and then we went back to part 2 of this very grim documentary about this very dim basketball player. And that hour was kind of good compared to the rest of them. Eventually, we moved Sports Night from Friday, Saturday, and Sunday nights to Monday through Friday at 5 p.m., so Sports Night was on in the afternoons. Though it was December, the limitless air conditioning continued. Susie Kolber began to wear a blanket on her lap just out of camera view. I begged to be returned to SportsCenter, and they agreed, provided I gave back the raise and extended my contract for a year and gave back a little bit more. Sports Illustrated, at that point still the leading and most influential sports media outlet in the world, warned us it was going to list in its year-end issue the worst things to happen in sports in 1993, and we, ESPN2, were going to be on it. And when the magazine came out, there on the list, behind the stabbing of the tennis star Monica Seles by a fan of her rival Steffi Graf, and behind Michael Jordan's retirement, and behind a college football player suing his coach because somebody else became the starting quarterback, there we were. Sports Illustrated's choice as the 7th worst thing in sports for 1993, and the reaction of the anchors and the staff and even the management and all 18 people who were in charge of ESPN2 Sports Night was unanimous. Hooray! We're not the worst! We're not the worst! We're not the worst! In my last week anchoring the show, we discovered that Walter Cronkite's lighting guy had never spoken to the guy who put in the air conditioning system. Walter Cronkite's lighting guy had focused the principal backlight in his state-of-the-art lighting system directly onto the principal monitor for the other guy's state-of-the-art air conditioning system. So the state-of-the-art air conditioning system had spent 6 months thinking the temperature in the studio was 217 degrees. They let me go back to SportsCenter, providing I gave back all the extra money, and I happily did it, and a little more. Sports Night staggered on for a few more weeks before being canceled, and all the talent, Stuart Scott, Susie Colbert, Bill Pito, and the guy they hired to replace me when I escaped back to SportsCenter, Kenny Mayne, they all went on to do SportsCenter. As to ESPN2, we all pretended that never happened. It's just a bad dream. And then there was that other reason I had agreed to try it. I have not told anybody this. I don't even think I told the other person involved this. But the night before ESPN management called me in and said, we'd like you to leave SportsCenter and become the face of ESPN2, a woman I worked with at ESPN said, yes, she would like to go out with me, but that doing that while we worked together would be a disaster. So, after management's offer, I asked her if my new schedule, which took me away from her department, was sufficient professional distance so that she'd feel comfortable dating, and she said yes. So I said yes, and we started dating. And that didn't work out either. I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. Countdown has come to you from the Vin Scully studio at the Olbermann Broadcasting Empire, high atop the Sports Capsule building in New York. The music you've heard was, for the most part, arranged, produced, and performed by Countdown's musical directors Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel. Brian Ray handled guitars, bass, and drums. John Philip Chanel did the orchestration and keyboards, and it was produced by TKO Brothers. Other music, including other works of Beethoven, arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed. The sports music is courtesy of ESPN Inc. It was written by Mitch Warren Davis. We call it the Olbermann theme from ESPN2. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by Nancy Faust, the best baseball stadium organist ever. Our announcer today was my friend Tony Kornheiser, and everything else was pretty much my fault. So that's Countdown for this, the 1,010th day since Donald Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Convict him now while we still can. The next scheduled countdown is tomorrow. Bulletins as the news warrants. Till then, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck.